widely recognized in many circles as America's most unpopular war. A war whose span lasted nearly 20 years. I believe the figure to be 19 years and some odd months. It was from the very first protest, which interestingly came from members of the Marine Corps in America that protested the use of their ships to disadvantage the underprivileged who were suffering in Vietnam, something along those lines. Famously, American protests occurred in places such as Yale, where university graduates were getting more educated on current affairs and the actual state of America, and saw how unfit this war was, much less the American involvement in a conflict that both geographically and geopolitically did not coincide with America in any way, at least in their point of view. I'm sure the government that chose to get involved in Vietnam would disagree towards those effects. But as a part of my research on the topic, I was studying the opposite effects. So what we don't consider, mostly because of our place of origin or our place of learning this history, that being America, that protests were not only an American thing. In fact, centralized obviously in South Vietnam, for North Vietnam being more authoritarian, and I would think they would have less of a tolerance for protesters, though it doesn't seem that the war was popular on either side. Regardless, for South Vietnam, it was a lot of the students taking matters into their own hands. Not only did Vietnam go through multiple presidents that were openly anti-war, but just as the Yale protests in America, with students getting sent home from school for wearing black armbands and literally storming the Pentagon, the children counterparts of South Korea were doing very similar things in the means of protesting the government. When we look at the real reason why America got involved, I'm sure that we would love it to be of the kindness of their own hearts. Honestly, I would really love it to be a well thought out approach, but more so in reality, America had come out of World War II, and their war with Japan in the Pacific, and a strong dislike for communism, as we can see in the Cold War and other less than successful interactions with the Soviet Union, when Stalin voiced his support for, well, not only Stalin, also Mao Zedong of North Korea, which, not the most popular of figures in history, supported the Viet guerrilla forces against the establishment. Putting it simply, America very much did not want France to preserve its pre-war empire, as they called it, but they also could not let these authoritarian, anti-capitalist figures take over another part of the world, and so came America's involvement. But returning to the issue, the core thing that I wanted to focus on was the actual involvement of Vietnamese students in protest. Famously, it was the Reverend Dr. King speech who did bring a lot of light to the issue and a lot of public attention, though that was something that was sort of a given in these scenarios. At this exact same time, there was these student groups in South Vietnam, and I find it so interesting because they, self-elected, self-represented, many people of the draft age that wanted an end to this war, that was brutal for civilians and those involved. It was mass loss of Vietnamese lives on both sides. But something, oh man, I think it's so interesting that I was learning about this. There was actually some covert parties that were student-run, like the Lao Dong Party, and in summary, they were in support of the Viet Cong. And as students, what was expected of them was to be anti-war, and as such, they almost infiltrated these rights, trying to push the war towards the Communist Party side. Though, as one can assume, in South Vietnam, the Communist Party was outlawed, so these students could not really voice their direct opinions under that. What does sadden me, in a way, is the continued response of countries to people's freedom of speech and right to peaceful assembly is often met with resistance. As we saw in America, actual legislation was passed to prohibit or limit free speech in times of war, as it might discourage people from joining the drafts and as such rebel against the government, which is something violent revolution, obviously, is frowned upon. Many protesters in Vietnam could not protest to the full extent of Americans, and even Americans in their own country were persecuted for their freedom of speech. Many were met with straight police brutality, the use of pepper sprays in clubs, along with water cannons and things of that means in order to disperse the population and end protest. Now, I think we can all agree that communism in the great span of governance, as it is not Marx's true capitalism, which is communism, which is not something that can truly exist in the world ever due to human nature. Being a communist was a crime punishable by prison, and even for teenagers, it was not uncommon for them to be tortured. I think something that I can see is just how often we overlook other countries and see them as an us and them conflict, where many times America's portrayed as the victor, or in this case, I would say that America's portrayed as an unnecessary participant in a bloody war. Regardless, we sometimes forget the similarities that we share with countries America might be in conflict with, or just countries with people, and how generations, regardless of their geography or leadership, often share a lot of values as a result of their teachings and the world that they grew up in. Current events can certainly shape a person. And so that's what I learned about the Vietnam War.